Stop that, immediately. The voice was not merely a command. It was a sonic boom of ice and fury, a sound that shattered the fragile sunlit peace of the grand living room. It was the voice of Richard Blackwood, a man accustomed to the world, bending to his will, a man for whom control was not just a preference but a necessity. He stood at the massive arched entrance to the room, a titan framed in mahogany, his fists clenched so tightly the knuckles were white, his face a thundercloud of disbelief and rage. He was watching a scene that, to any other eye, would have been one of exquisite, heartbreaking beauty. But to Richard, it was a violation, a desecration. His 8-year-old daughter, Sophia, was in her wheelchair in the center of the vast Persian rug, and she was smiling. It was not the one, polite, ghost of a smile she reserved for her doctors and therapists. It was a genuine, radiant, soul-deep smile, the first he had seen light up her small, pale face in 6 long, agonizing months. Her eyes, the same startling blue as her late mother's, were sparkling with a joy he thought had been extinguished forever. Next to her, Andre Silva, the driver he had hired just 3 weeks ago, was dancing. It was a gentle, fluid movement, a slow, graceful samba to the soft, melodic Brazilian music playing from his cell phone, which rested on a nearby table. The 32-year-old man, a figure of quiet competence whom Richard had barely noticed until now, held Sophia's small, delicate hand in his own. He spun slowly, carefully, around her chair, his movements a silent conversation with the music, and Sophia, his beautiful, broken Sophia, was clapping her hands in time, her laughter a sound like tiny silver bells, a sound Richard hadn't heard since before the accident, before their world had shattered. "What the hell do you think you're doing with my daughter?" Richard's voice was a low, dangerous growl as he lunged into the room, his expensive, handmade shoes silent on the thick rug. Andre immediately stopped dancing, his body freezing in mid. He gently, reluctantly, let go of Sophia's hand. The girl's smile vanished as if a switch had been flipped, her face crumpling into an expression of confusion and a familiar, deep-seated fear. Andre remained preternaturally calm, his hands raised in a peaceful, non-threatening gesture. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice soft, with a slight, almost imperceptible accent Richard had never bothered to place. "I can explain." "Explain." Richard's voice was laden with a cold, righteous indignation. He felt violated, as if he had walked in on an intruder, a trespasser in the most sacred, private space of his life. "You were hired to drive my car, to open doors, to be invisible, not to do whatever this is." He gestured furiously towards the cell phone, which was still playing the soft, rhythmic music, a sound that now seemed to mock him, to fill the room with an intimacy he found unbearable. "Turn that thing off, now." Sophia began to cry, not loudly, but with the silent, heartbreaking sobs of a child who has learned that making noise only brings more trouble. Andre, his movements still calm and deliberate, quickly walked to the table and paused the music. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, thick with unspoken pain and anger. Richard looked at his daughter, at her tear-streaked face, at the way she had withdrawn into herself, her small body seeming to shrink in the oversized wheelchair. And then he looked at Andre, at the driver's calm, unreadable expression, and something in his chest tightened, a painful, familiar knot of grief and rage, and a profound, terrifying helplessness he couldn't name. "Daddy, please," Sophia whispered, her voice small and broken, a sound that always managed to pierce through the thick armor of his anger. "Andre was he was teaching me to dance, like the other kids. You can't dance." The words were a brutal, reflexive explosion out of his mouth before he could stop them, before he could temper their cruelty. "Wheelchair, Sophia, the sooner you accept that, the better it will be for everyone." He saw Andre's face twitch, a flicker of some unidentifiable emotion in the man's dark, steady eyes. But he remained silent. There was something in his gaze, not anger, not fear, but a deep, unnerving understanding that Richard couldn't quite place. It was as if this man, this stranger, this employee, knew exactly the kind of pain that made a father say such a monstrous thing to his own child. "Mr. Blackwood," Andre said, his voice still impossibly, infuriatingly calm. "Can I please speak with you? Privately?" "There is nothing to discuss," Richard replied, his voice curt, final. He needed to reassert control, he needed to purge this violation from his house. "Get your things, you're fired." Andre nodded slowly, a single, deliberate inclination of his head. There was no surprise in his expression, no pleading, no desperation. It was as if he had been expecting this. Before turning to leave, he looked at Sophia one last time, a look of such profound, gentle sadness that it made Richard's gut clench. "Remember what we talked about with the butterflies, little one," Andre said softly, his voice a gentle caress. "Some fly differently, but they still fly." As Andre walked towards the door, his posture erect, his movements graceful, Richard noticed something that made him deeply uneasy. The man didn't seem like someone who had just been summarily, humiliatingly fired. There was a serenity in his movements, a quiet dignity in his bearing, that was utterly at odds with his situation. It was as if he knew something that Richard didn't. Sophia's silent sobs had now turned into full-blown, heart-wrenching wails. Richard knelt beside her chair, his own heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest, and tried to comfort her, but his words, his apologies, his promises of new toys, of new trips, sounded hollow and empty, even to his own ears. "Why did you send him away?" Sophia asked, her small voice choked with sobs, her tiny hands beating a frustrated, helpless rhythm on the arms of her wheelchair. "Why, Daddy? He made me feel normal again." Richard didn't know how to respond. He had no answer. For 6 months, ever since the car accident that had killed his beloved wife, Alina, and had left his precious daughter paralyzed from the waist down, he had tried everything. He had hired the best physical therapists in the country, the most renowned child psychologists, the most sought-after specialists in spinal cord injuries. He had spent a fortune, called in every favor, moved heaven and earth, and none of them, not a single one, had been able to elicit a genuine, heartfelt smile from his daughter, until the driver, as he watched Sophia wipe her tears with the back of her small hand, her small body racked with a grief that was far too large for her. Richard felt a cold, terrifying sliver of doubt pierce through his anger. Had he made a terrible, irreversible mistake? There was something about that driver, something that didn't fit, something that had set off alarm bells in his sharp, analytical mind from the very beginning. But they weren't the kind of alarm bells he would have expected. It wasn't the fear of an opportunist or a charlatan. It was something else entirely, something he couldn't yet understand. 3 days had passed since the explosive dismissal of Andre Silva, and the Blackwood mansion seemed to have returned to its quiet, cold, and suffocating routine. On the surface, everything was as it should be. The army of servants moved through the vast, silent rooms with their usual hushed efficiency. The clocks ticked with a relentless, metronomic precision. The sun streamed through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still, sterile air. Richard threw himself into his work with a renewed, frantic energy, a desperate attempt to outrun the gnawing, persistent feeling of unease that had taken root in his gut. He worked 16-hour days, barking orders at his subordinates, navigating complex, multi-million-dollar deals with a ruthless, single-minded focus. He told himself, over and over, that he had made the right decision, the only decision. He was a father protecting his child. He couldn't allow a stranger, an employee, to insinuate himself into their lives, to take advantage of his daughter's profound vulnerability. It was a matter of safety, of boundaries, of control. But Sophia was not cooperating with his carefully constructed plan for a return to normality. The fragile, tentative light that Andre had managed to coax back into her eyes had been extinguished, replaced by a dull, listless apathy that was far more terrifying to Richard than her earlier, more volatile grief. The girl refused to leave her room. She pushed away the exquisite, tempting meals that the private chef prepared for her, the very same meals that had once so infuriated him when he saw them go to waste. And she cried, a low, constant, heartbreaking whimper whenever she heard the sound of a car in the long, sweeping driveway, her small heart hoping, praying, that it was Andre, returning for her. The team of expensive, highly credentialed physical therapists hired by Richard reported a complete and total resistance. She simply refused to participate in any of their carefully planned, scientifically backed activities. She would lie limp and unresponsive during her sessions, her eyes closed, her small face a mask of stubborn, silent defiance. "Daddy, why isn't Andre coming back?" Sophia asked for the 10th time that morning, her small, tear-stained face buried in her pillow. The question was a tiny, sharp dagger that pierced Richard's heart every time she uttered it. "We've already talked about this, sweetheart," Richard replied, his voice tight, his patience wearing thin. He was standing in front of the massive, antique mirror in his dressing room, adjusting the knot of his silk tie. He had a crucial meeting with a group of Japanese investors, a deal that couldn't be postponed, not even for the quiet, suffocating drama that was unfolding in his own home. He wasn't the right person for the job here, but he understood me. "Sophia," murmured her voice so soft it was almost inaudible. She turned her face to the wall, a small, final gesture of dismissal. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, in a small, modest apartment in a neighborhood that Richard Blackwood would have considered a slum, Andre Silva was sitting at his small, worn kitchen table. He was typing calmly, methodically, on a sleek state-of-the-art laptop, a piece of technology that seemed utterly at odds with the humble, sparsely furnished apartment where he lived. The screen of the laptop showed a series of emails, written in fluent, idiomatic English, French, and Portuguese. It was a correspondence that a simple, uneducated driver should never have been able to maintain. His phone, a new top-of-the-line model, rang. He answered it, his voice calm and professional. Dr. Silva. The voice on the other end said, speaking in perfect Parisian French, "The university would like to confirm your availability for the keynote lecture on neuroplasticity and pediatric trauma next week. I'm afraid I'll need to postpone it for a few days," Andre replied in the same language, his eyes never leaving the photograph he had propped up on the table beside his laptop. It was a photo he had discreetly taken with his phone during one of Sophia's dance classes. In it, she was laughing, her head thrown back in pure, unadulterated joy. "I have a special case here that requires my full attention." Richard Blackwood, in his haste and his arrogance, had never bothered to properly investigate Andre Silva's background. He had relied on the cursory, superficial check provided by the high-end employment agency he used. Had he dug deeper, had he bothered to look beyond the man's job title and the color of his skin, he would have discovered that the man he had hired as his driver held a PhD in neuroscience from the Sorbonne in Paris. He would have discovered that this simple driver was a well-known specialist in the field of music and movement therapy for children with severe neurological trauma. And he would have discovered that Dr. Andre Silva had abandoned a brilliant, promising academic career in Paris after a devastating personal tragedy. But there was something else, something much deeper, much more personal, something that even the most thorough, most expensive private investigation would not have revealed. Andre had known the Blackwood family for much longer than Richard could ever have imagined. Thus Richard prepared to leave for another long, grueling day of trying to ignore his daughter's silent, heartbreaking sobs. His personal assistant, a sharp, efficient young man named James, entered his office, a worried expression on his face. "Mr. Blackwood, I need to report something strange," James said, consulting the screen of his tablet. "It's about the driver you fired, Andre Silva." Richard frowned, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "What about him?" "Well, sir," James continued, clearly uncomfortable, "he didn't try to contest the dismissal. He didn't ask for a reference. He didn't seem desperate or angry at all. He just left. And he hasn't cashed his final paycheck." Richard's stomach tightened slightly. Andre's calm, almost serene, reaction to being fired had bothered him from the very beginning. It was unnatural. "So what?" he snapped. "Maybe he already had another job lined up. It's just that I took the liberty of doing some checking," Sir James said, his voice hesitant, a little deeper than the agency did, "and I found out that he has advanced academic training. He speaks 4 languages fluently." And James hesitated, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and intrigue. "There are records of him working as a consultant with special needs children in several high-profile pediatric hospitals in Europe." Richard felt a cold, prickling sensation on the back of his neck. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "Because you didn't ask for a full background check, sir," James replied, his voice quiet but firm. "You said you just needed someone to drive. You said the less you knew about him, the better." Richard vaguely remembered the job interview. It had been brief, perfunctory. Andre had been recommended by the employment agency as highly qualified and experienced with high-net-worth families. He had assumed, with the casual, unthinking arrogance of the wealthy, that referred only to his experience as a driver. That afternoon, Richard returned home early, a rare occurrence. He found Sophia exactly as he had left her that morning, a small, motionless figure on her large canopied bed, staring out the window at the perfectly manicured empty gardens. But this time she was whispering something to herself, a soft, repetitive chant. "Who are you talking to, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice gentle as he approached her bed. "The butterflies," Sophia replied, her voice a dreamy, distant murmur. She didn't turn around. "Andre taught me. He said that some butterflies fly differently, but they still fly. Like me." Richard felt the familiar, painful tightening in his chest. Those were the last words Andre had said to Sophia before he had walked out of their lives forever. Later that night, long after Sophia had cried herself to sleep, Richard found himself inexplicably drawn to the vast empty garage. It was the space where he used to find Andre, meticulously cleaning one of the luxury cars, humming softly to himself. The space was now eerily empty and silent, but something on the passenger seat of the Rolls-Royce, the car Andre had usually driven, caught his eye. It was a small, elegant, black leather folder. Richard opened it, his heart pounding with a strange, inexplicable sense of dread. He was expecting to find personal documents, a resume perhaps. Instead, he found a collection of medical articles, all of them highly technical, all of them on the subject of infantile paralysis and neurological trauma. He found a series of detailed, handwritten notes on the specific case of SPB. Sophia Penelope Blackwood. The notes were detailed, professional, and they revealed a depth of knowledge about Sophia's specific condition, about her prognosis, about her potential for recovery, that went far, far beyond what any driver, any layman, should possibly possess. There were complex exercise diagrams, carefully planned musical progressions, and a detailed holistic treatment plan that stretched out over a period of months. And then, at the very bottom of the folder, Richard found a faded photograph. It was a picture of a young man in a white doctor's coat, standing next to a beautiful, blonde woman who was lying in a hospital bed. They were both smiling at the camera, a shared, secret smile of hope and complicity. The woman in the bed had the same startling, brilliant blue eyes as Sophia. It was his wife, Alina, the woman who had died in the fiery, twisted wreckage of the car accident that had left their daughter paralyzed. The photograph was dated 6 years ago. The location stamp on the back read, Hôpital, Necker-en-Fonds, Malades, Paris, and underneath the date, there was a small, neat inscription, written in French. Dr. Andre Silva, specialist in traumatisms, neurologiques, pediatrics, and consultation, Ovic Alina Blackwood. Dr. Andre Silva, specialist in pediatric neurological trauma, in consultation with Alina Blackwood. Richard dropped the photograph as if it had burned his fingers. His hands were shaking, his mind reeling, the solid ground of his reality crumbling into dust beneath his feet. Andre wasn't just a skilled driver who had, by some strange coincidence, happened to appear in his life. He had known Alina, treated his wife, and now, 6 years later, he had mysteriously, impossibly, turned up to work as a driver in his house, at the very moment that Sophia needed him the most. Every new humiliation Richard had inflicted on Andre, every harsh, dismissive word, every look of cold, arrogant contempt, now took on a completely different and horrifying weight. The man he had so cruelly, so casually, fired, was not an opportunist trying to take advantage of a vulnerable, grieving child. He was, quite possibly, the only person in the entire world who really, truly, knew how to help Sophia, and Richard Blackwood, in his blindness and his arrogance, had just sent him away. The next morning, Richard was a ghost in his own life. He couldn't concentrate on any of his meetings. The numbers on the spreadsheets blurred into a meaningless jumble. The confident, booming voices of his executives faded into a dull, distant roar. The only thing he could see, the only thing he could hear, was the image of that photograph, of his dead wife smiling at the man he had fired, and the sound of his own daughter's heartbreaking sobs. How was it possible? How could fate, how could the universe, be so cruel, so precise, so poetic in its retribution, to have brought his wife's doctor, the one man she had apparently trusted, to work as a driver in his own home, at the very moment that his daughter needed him the most? It couldn't be a coincidence. It was a message, a test, and he had failed it. Spectacularly, Richard cancelled all of his appointments for the rest of the day. He stormed into his assistant's office, his face a mask of grim, desperate determination. "James," he said, his voice a low, urgent command, "I want you to hire a private investigation agency. The best, the most expensive. I don't care what it costs. I want everything on Andre Silva, every document, every job, every address, every breath he's taken in the last 15 years. I want to know everything." Sir James asked, his own face pale with a mixture of concern and confusion. "May I ask why this is so urgent?" "I have just found out that our former driver is not who we thought he was," Richard replied, his hand still trembling as he clutched the photograph, which he had taken from the folder. "And I need to know exactly who and what I have been dealing with." Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Sophia had taken a turn for the worse. She had refused to eat anything at all that day. She wouldn't speak to anyone, not even her favorite nanny, and she had developed a low-grade fever, a strange, persistent fever that the family's pediatrician, Dr. Peterson couldn't explain. The physical therapist, a cheerful, energetic woman who had always managed to coax at least a flicker of cooperation from Sophia, reported that the girl had simply closed her eyes during their entire session, her small body limp and unresponsive, as if she had given up completely. "It's as if she's lost the will to live," Dr. Peterson murmured, his voice grave. After examining Sophia later that afternoon, he was a kind, competent man, but he was at a loss. Sometimes, children who have suffered a profound trauma, they develop very specific, very intense emotional attachments. When those connections are abruptly and traumatically severed. "Are you suggesting," Richard interrupted, his voice heavy with a mixture of disbelief and a rising defensive irritation, "that my daughter is sick because I fired a driver?" "I'm suggesting, Mr. Blackwood," the doctor replied gently but firmly, "that you may have severely underestimated the importance of this particular person in your daughter's recovery." That afternoon, the private investigation agency's preliminary report arrived in a heavily encrypted email. Richard locked himself in his office, his heart pounding a frantic, fearful rhythm against his ribs, and began to read. And with every page he read, with every new, shocking revelation, the carefully constructed certainties of his world crumbled, page by page, into dust. Andre Silva had graduated, summa cum laude, from the University of São Paulo with a degree in medicine. He had gone on to specialize in pediatric neurology at the Sorbonne in Paris, where he had graduated at the top of his class. For 6 years, he had worked at the prestigious Hôpital Nécaron Malades in Paris, the very same hospital where Alina had been treated during a research fellowship she had undertaken there. But there was more, much, much more. That Andre had lost his own daughter in a car accident 3 years ago. Luna Silva, aged 5. She had died in circumstances eerily, tragically, similar to those that had left Sophia paralyzed. After the tragedy, the report stated, Dr. Andre Silva had abruptly abandoned his promising career in traditional, clinical medicine. He had, according to his colleagues, suffered a profound crisis of faith in the limitations of Western medicine. He had then begun to develop his own, unconventional, and highly controversial, techniques of therapy, using music and movement to treat traumatized children. The report included links to several scientific articles Andre had published in obscure, but respected medical journals, citations in international neurological conferences, and something that made Richard's blood run cold, a link to an interview he had given to a French newspaper 2 years earlier. In the interview, Andre had spoken of his intention to find other children like his lost Luna, and to offer them a second chance. A second chance to smile, a second chance to fly. Richard's hand was shaking so badly he could barely hold his phone. He dialed Andre's number, the number he had gotten from the employment agency's files. The phone rang several times, each ring a hammer blow to his already shattered composure. Finally, a calm, quiet voice answered. "I know you found out who I am," Andre said, without even waiting for a greeting. "Why?" Richard asked, his voice a raw, broken whisper. "Why didn't you tell me from the beginning?" "Because men like you, Mr. Blackwood," Andre replied, his voice sad, but not unkind, "don't hire world-renowned ex-doctors to drive their cars. You hire chauffeurs. You hire people to be invisible." And Sophia needed someone who could be close to her, who could be around her, without raising suspicion, without the pressure of expectations. "Suspicion," Richard repeated, his mind still reeling. "What kind of sick, twisted game are you playing with my family?" Andre sighed, a deep, weary sound on the other end of the line. "Mr. Blackwood, your wife Alina, she came to see me in Paris, 6 months before the accident. She was researching alternative treatments for infantile paralysis, because the doctors here had already diagnosed a potential problem, a genetic marker they had found during her pregnancy, a marker that indicated a high risk of a neurological condition that could affect Sophia in the future." Richard felt as if the floor had disappeared from beneath his feet, as if he were in a freefall, just like the one his daughter had described from her nightmares. "That's impossible," he stammered. "Sophia was born perfectly healthy. The doctors said so. She was," Andre confirmed. But Alina knew there was a risk, a ticking time bomb. She was preparing a preventive treatment plan, a contingency plan, just in case something ever happened. "She made me promise, Mr. Blackwood, she made me promise that if Sophia ever needed it, I would do everything in my power to find her, and to help her." Andre's words echoed in the silent, opulent office like a confession, a revelation that completely and irrevocably rewrote the entire history of his life, of his marriage, of his daughter's tragedy. Alina had kept a medical secret from him, a secret of monumental proportions. She had been preparing for a tragedy that had not yet happened. "You're lying," Richard muttered, but his voice lacked any conviction. It was the desperate, pathetic denial of a man who knew, in his heart, that he was hearing the truth. "It's in her will, Mr. Blackwood," Andre said softly, "in the section that your lawyers probably dismissed as the sentimental, emotional delusions of a worried, pregnant woman." Alina left very specific, very detailed instructions on how Sophia should be treated in the event of a neurological trauma or paralysis. Richard, his hands trembling, quickly opened the digital files of Elena's will on his computer. He scrolled through the dense, legalistic text, his eyes scanning the pages frantically, and then he found it, on page 17, a section he had completely, utterly overlooked. A section his high-priced lawyers had indeed dismissed as non-binding and emotionally driven. "In the event of a significant neurological trauma or paralysis involving our daughter, Sophia Penelope Blackwood, I strongly, and with my full heart, recommend that my husband, Richard, contact Dr. Andre Silva, a specialist in unconventional pediatric therapy, currently residing in Paris. His methods may seem unorthodox, but they work where traditional medicine fails. He understands the connection between the body, the music, and the soul." "My God," Richard whispered, dropping the phone onto his desk. James, his assistant, appeared at the door at that very moment, his face pale, holding a folder of documents. "Sir," he said, his voice hesitant, "there's something else you need to see. I found records of payments that your wife made to a clinic in Paris, monthly payments that continued to be automatically debited from a joint account until just last month." Richard took the documents with numb, unfeeling hands. Alina had been paying for a children's rehabilitation clinic, a clinic for traumatized children, a clinic where, the documents showed, Dr. Andre Silva worked as a part-time pro bono consultant. "He's been watching us," Richard muttered, the full, terrifying, and strangely beautiful scope of the situation finally dawning on him. "He's been waiting, not watching, sir," James corrected him gently, his own voice full of a new, profound respect for the man they had all so badly misjudged, "waiting to be needed." And in that moment, Richard Blackwood finally, truly, understood the full crushing extent of his own arrogance. He had humiliatingly, cruelly fired the only man in the entire world his own beloved, deceased wife had specifically chosen to take care of their daughter. He had treated as an opportunist, a charlatan, a brilliant, compassionate doctor, who had apparently abandoned a brilliant career to fulfill a sacred promise made to a dead woman. And worse, much, much worse, he had done it all in front of Sophia, shattering the only genuine, healing connection the poor, broken girl had managed to form since the accident that had destroyed her world. Richard picked up the phone and dialed Andre's number again. His hand was steady now, his mind was clear. "I need you to come back," he said, his voice raw with a new, unfamiliar emotion, humility. "That's not how it works, Mr. Blackwood," Andre replied calmly, his voice firm, but not unkind. "I am not an employee that you can fire and rehire at your convenience. I am a doctor, and I made a promise." "Then what do you want from me?" Richard asked, his voice breaking. "I want you to stop trying to control your daughter's healing," Andre said, his voice quiet but powerful, "and I want you to start participating in it. I want you to admit to yourself that you do not, in fact, know what is best for Sophia. And most of all," he added, his voice softening slightly, "I want you to apologize, not to me, to her." Richard swallowed his pride. It was a bitter, difficult pill, the hardest one he had ever had to swallow in his entire privileged life. "And if I do that?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Then maybe," Andre replied, "just maybe, Sophia still has a chance at happiness." As Richard was processing the full, devastating magnitude of his own mistakes, a notification popped up on his phone. It was a text message from an unknown number. It was from Andre. "Sophia asked me to send this to you." It was a video, 3 minutes long. In the video, Sophia was sitting in her wheelchair, in what looked like a small sunlit doctor's office. She was smiling, a real, genuine, beautiful smile, as she moved her arms in perfect, graceful sync with a piece of soft, melodic music. Her legs, though immobile, were swaying slightly, almost imperceptibly, to the rhythm. Andre appeared briefly, in the corner of the screen, his back to the camera, guiding her movements with an infinite, loving patience. The message that accompanied the video was devastating in its simple, heartbreaking truth. She recorded this for you last week, when she still believed that you loved her more than you loved your own pride. Richard realized, in that moment, that he had lost much more than an employee. He had lost his own daughter's trust. And now, for the first time in his entire successful, powerful life, he wasn't sure if he could ever regain what he had so carelessly, so cruelly, destroyed. But as he watched the video for the 5th time, for the 10th time, a new, different kind of determination began to grow in his chest. It was not the familiar, arrogant determination to control, to command, to win. It was the quiet, humble, and terrifying determination to learn. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to become the father that his daughter, and his wife, had always deserved. Across town, Andre hung up the phone and looked at the small, framed photograph on his desk. It was of his own daughter, Luna, smiling, her head thrown back in laughter, sitting in a rocking chair shortly before the accident that had taken her from him. One more, my little one, he whispered, his voice thick with a grief that would never truly fade. We'll save one more. Richard drove to Andre's apartment unannounced, the crumpled, tear-stained investigation report folded in his trembling hand. He found him sitting on the small, sun-drenched balcony of his modest apartment, reading a book in French, as if he had been expecting this visit all along. The quiet, peaceful scene was so utterly at odds with the storm raging in Richard's own soul that it made him feel dizzy. You planned all of this, Richard said, his voice blunt, raw with a mixture of anger, confusion, and a dawning, grudging respect. He didn't bother with greetings or pleasantries. He climbed the short flight of steps leading up to the small apartment and stood before Andre, a titan of industry humbled before a man he had once considered his servant. From day one, Andre calmly, deliberately, closed his book, marking his page with a practiced, gentle movement. He gestured to the empty chair beside him, a simple, weathered wooden chair that probably cost less than one of Richard's handmade Italian shoes. Sit down, Mr. Blackwood, he said, his voice calm, his gaze steady. It's time we talked. Like two men who loved the same child. No, Richard exploded, the last vestiges of his pride, of his anger, flaring up one last time. You lied to me. You lied about who you were. You manipulated your way into my family. You used my wife's memory to fulfill a promise I made to her. Andre interrupted, his voice still calm, but now with a firm, unyielding edge. A promise that you, in your grief and your need for control, never knew she asked me to make. Richard threw the crumpled report onto the small table between them. I know everything, he said, his voice a low, defeated growl. I know about Luna, your daughter. I know about how you abandoned medicine after she died. I know about how you've been using other children, using my child, to try and make up for your own loss. Andre's face twitched, a flicker of deep, profound pain in his dark eyes, but he did not deny it. You are right about one thing, Mr. Blackwood, he said, his voice soft, but clear. Every child I helped, every smile I can bring back to a child's face, it brings my Luna back to me. For a few, precious moments, but if you think, for 1 second, that diminishes my love for Sophia or my dedication to her healing, then you are very, very much mistaken. How dare you? Richard began, his voice choked with a confusion he couldn't articulate, but Andre interrupted him again, his voice now filled with a quiet, sad power. Your wife Alina, she came to me because she knew you. She knew you better than you know yourself. She knew that you would never accept unconventional methods. She knew your deep, desperate need to control everything, to have neat, scientific answers for messy emotional problems. She knew that if something were to happen to Sophia, you would surround her with the best, most expensive, most traditional doctors in the world. And she knew that for a child like Sophia, for a trauma like the one she feared, that would not be enough. He paused, his gaze unwavering. She asked me to promise her, Richard. She made me promise that if anything ever happened to Sophia, I would find a way to be there for her, even if it meant lying about who I really was. Even if it meant facing your anger, your prejudice, your contempt. Andre reached into the pocket of his simple linen shirt and pulled out a yellowed, folded letter. Alina wrote this for you, he said, his voice gentle. But she asked me to give it to you only when the time was right. Only when you were ready to hear it. Richard immediately recognized his wife's elegant, looping handwriting on the front of the envelope. With hands that were now shaking uncontrollably, he opened the letter and read the words that his beloved, deceased wife had written for him from beyond the grave. My dearest Richard, if Andre is giving you this letter, it means that our beautiful, precious daughter needs him, and it means that you are fighting it. Please, my love, I am begging you, stop trying to fix Sophia. Stop trying to control her, and just start loving her. Loving her for who she is, right now, in this moment. Let Andre help her. He is a good man. He is a brilliant man. He lost his own daughter, his own beautiful butterfly, but I know with all my heart that he can save ours. Tears, hot and shameful, began to roll down Richard's cheeks. He had not cried, not really, since the day of the accident. He had been too busy being strong, being in control, managing the unmanageable. Now, the dam of his grief, of his guilt, of his profound, shattering regret, finally broke. Why? He whispered, his voice a raw, broken sound. Why didn't you tell me this? From the beginning, because you weren't ready to hear it, Andre replied softly, his voice full of a deep, sad wisdom. You needed to see Sophia smile again first. You needed to see, with your own eyes, that not everything in this world can be controlled, or commanded, or bought. At that very moment, Richard's phone rang, the shrill, panicked sound cutting through the quiet, emotional intensity of the moment. It was Carla, Sophia's private nurse. Her voice was filled with a frantic, rising panic. Mr. Blackwood, you need to come home. Immediately. It's Sophia. She's out of her bed. She's trying to walk on her own. She says she won't stop until Andre comes back. Richard felt his world, which had just been shattered, collapse for a second time in a single day. I'm on my way, he said to Andre, his voice now a desperate, pleading command. You're coming with me. Not as your employee, Andre replied, his voice firm, his gaze steady. I will come with you as your daughter's doctor. I will come with you as the man your wife chose to take care of her, and I will come with you as someone who will no longer, ever, accept being treated as an inferior for trying to save your family. Are we clear? On the frantic, silent drive back to the mansion, Richard finally asked the question that had been hammering in his head, the question that was at the very heart of his own shame. What do you really want from me, Andre? I want you to stop seeing my color before you see my competence, Andre said, his voice quiet but powerful. Each word a carefully aimed arrow that found its mark in Richard's guilty heart. I want you to stop thinking that because I am Brazilian, and because I was driving your car, that I could not possibly be qualified to take care of your daughter. And most of all, he added, his voice softening, I want you to admit that you spent 6 months, and a fortune, paying the best specialists in the world. But you fired the only one who really, truly, worked. Because he didn't look like what you expected a doctor to look like. Andre's words cut deeper and more cleanly than any of the revelations from the investigation report. Richard realized, with a sickening, profound clarity, that he had judged Andre not just as an employee, but as a man. He had carried all the ugly, unexamined prejudices of his privileged world, and he had projected them onto this good, brilliant, and compassionate man. When they arrived at the mansion, they found Sophia in the grand hallway. She was leaning heavily on her wheelchair, but her feet were on the floor. She was trying to take small, agonizing, shuffling steps. Tears of pain and frustration were streaming down her face, but she would not stop. Sophia, Richard cried, running towards her, his heart breaking at the sight of her struggle. But she raised a small, trembling hand, stopping him in his tracks. No, Daddy, she said, her voice a fierce, determined whisper. I have to show Andre. I have to show him that I didn't give up. Andre approached her slowly, his movements calm and gentle. He knelt down on the marble floor, so that he was at her height. I always knew you could do it, my little butterfly, he said, his voice a soft, loving caress. But you don't have to hurt yourself to prove it to me. Will you come back? Sophia asked, her voice small and full of a desperate, fragile hope. Andre looked up at Richard, his dark, intelligent eyes full of a silent, profound question, and Richard finally, truly, understood. This wasn't about hiring an employee. It was about accepting help. It was about swallowing his pride, his arrogance, his prejudice. It was about admitting that he, Richard Blackwood, the titan of industry, the master of the universe, had been wrong. Andre, Richard said, his own voice breaking with the weight of his shame, of his regret. I don't know how to apologize for what I did. I don't know how to make up for my prejudice, my arrogance, but if there is still a chance, I would like you to come back. Not as a driver, as the doctor my wife chose, as the person who made my daughter smile again. Andre smiled, a genuine, warm, forgiving smile, the first Richard had ever seen from him. Only if you promise me one thing, he said. Anything, Richard breathed. The next time I teach Sophia how to dance, Andre said, his eyes sparkling with a new, gentle humor, you will dance with her, too. because she needs her father, not just her doctor. And there, in the grand, cold hallway of that magnificent mansion, a place that had been a silent, gilded tomb for so long, the most beautiful, most miraculous of creations began. It was the creation of a new family, a family learning, slowly and painfully, that love knows no prejudice, that healing knows no boundaries, and that sometimes the most powerful, most transformative medicine in the world is simply having the courage to accept help from those who are willing to offer it, regardless of what they look like or where they come from. 2 years later, the Blackwood mansion was no longer a silent, gilded tomb. It had been completely and joyfully transformed. The vast, echoing rooms were now filled with the sounds of music, of laughter, of the worry of wheelchairs, and the determined, shuffling steps of children learning to fly in their own unique ways. The Different Butterflies Project, a state-of-the-art non-profit rehabilitation center for children with neurological disabilities, now occupied the entire ground floor of the mansion, a project created and funded through a remarkable and unlikely partnership between the once arrogant billionaire Richard Blackwood and the brilliant, compassionate doctor he had once mistaken for his driver. Dr. Andre Silva. Sophia, now 10 years old, walked with the aid of lightweight carbon fiber crutches, and she danced regularly. Her laughter, once a rare and precious sound, now echoed through the halls of the house that had been transformed from a prison of grief into a center of hope. "Dad," she announced one afternoon, bursting into his office, her blue eyes sparkling with excitement, "today we're going to teach the new girl, Maria, how to dance. She's scared, but I'm going to show her that dancing in a chair is beautiful too." Richard smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes. He remembered, with a pang of shame, the time when he had thought it was impossible for someone in a wheelchair to dance. Andre had become much more than a doctor. He was a partner, a friend, the brother Richard never knew he needed. During meetings with potential investors for the project, Richard now made a point of telling the truth, his own painful, shameful truth. "I almost destroyed my own daughter's only chance at happiness," he would say, his voice full of a new, hard-won humility, "because I judged an extraordinary, brilliant doctor by the color of his skin. My prejudice, my blindness, almost cost my daughter her happiness." The graduation ceremony for the first class of the Different Butterflies Project took place in the grand ballroom of the mansion. 23 children, all of whom had been told by traditional doctors that they would never walk, or dance, or live a normal life, had completed the program. Sophia, the project's first and most inspiring graduate, took to the stage with her crutches and danced a beautiful, moving routine that she had choreographed herself. 2 years ago, she said into the microphone, her voice clear and confident, "I thought I would never be happy again. Today, I know that being different doesn't mean you're less special. It just means you fly in your own, unique, beautiful way." Andre watched from the side of the stage, his eyes filled with tears, remembering his first words to her. Some butterflies fly differently, but they still fly. Richard had lost some of his old friends, the ones from his elite, privileged circle who could not accept or understand his new life, his new partnership with a black, Brazilian man. But he had gained something infinitely more valuable. He had gained a real family, and he had gained a purpose. "I learned that prejudice is not just an injustice you commit against other people," he said in a national television interview that was watched by millions. "It's a prison you build for yourself." When I finally allowed myself to see Andre for who he really was, I didn't just save my daughter, I saved myself. The Different Butterflies Project now served over 300 families a year. Andre, true to his word, had published his entire methodology, his unique blend of music, movement, and neuroscience, free of charge, for doctors and therapists all over the world to use. Richard, the man who had once been obsessed with building his financial fortune, had discovered that building lives, building hope, was infinitely more rewarding. The mansion that had once been a silent, cold tomb now pulsed with music, with life, with hope. And Richard Blackwood, the man who had once been so blinded by his own prejudice, had proven that the best, most powerful revenge against one's own ignorance is to turn it into a bridge to a better, more compassionate, more beautiful world. If this story has shown you how our own judgments can blind us to the miracles that are standing right in front of us, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that human greatness has no color, no class, and no creed. Stories that prove that the most profound healing and the most beautiful dances often come from the most unexpected of partners.